Everywhere you go in the world, you'll find monuments to a different age. From the earliest settlements to the new millennium, every civilization has left its mark. These great historic sites give us fascinating insight into the way people lived and the kind of world they lived in.
In this Globetrekker special, exploring many of the world's most spectacular historic sites, we'll be traveling from the heart of Europe, across the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and the Americas, visiting sites dating from medieval times right up to the 19th century. Joining Megan McCormick on this tour of the world's great historic sites from the Age of Empire are Justine Shapiro, Christina Chang, Estelle Bingham, Zoe Palmer, Adela Ukar, Katie Haswell, Holly Morris, Ian Wright, and I, Zay Harding. In contrast to the map of the world as we know it today, in medieval times, Europeans knew very little of the world beyond Europe and the countries around the Mediterranean. In fact, Jerusalem, sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims, was depicted at the center of most medieval world maps, in honor of the religious importance of its great historic sites.
They say if you want to get a feel for what life might have been like in ancient Jerusalem, this is the gate to enter, Damascus Gate.
Damascus Gate takes you into the heart of the Muslim quarter. The markets or souks here are the busiest in the old city and have been around for hundreds of years. By far the largest area in the Muslim quarter is the Haram Ash-Sharif, a religious space dominated by the magnificent Dome of the Rock shrine. Built back in the 7th century, soon after the capture of Jerusalem from the Christian Byzantine Empire, the Dome on the Rock is extremely holy to Muslims, as it's where Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven. For Christians, the holiest part of the city is very close by.
I'm on the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Suffering. It's the main road in the Christian quarter, and supposedly it's the very path that Jesus took when he carried the cross to his own crucifixion.
For 1,000 years since the days of the Crusades, Christian pilgrims have come to Jerusalem to walk the Via Dolorosa. The journey ends at the holiest Christian site in the city, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, built on the exact spot where Jesus is believed to have been crucified and then buried. En route from Europe to try to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim rule, the Christian Crusader armies fought through what is modern Syria. Two remarkable fortresses from this era, Crac des Chevaliers, built by the Crusaders, and the Muslim-built citadel at Aleppo, are visited by Holly Morris.
No trip to Aleppo would be complete without paying a visit to its most impressive landmark, the Citadel. Built between the 12th and 15th centuries, partly to defend against invading Crusader armies from Europe, the Citadel is one of the most magnificent military structures in the Middle East and marks a golden age for Islam. The citadel is spectacular. As part of its original defense system, it had 14 watchtowers, and then these steep slopes were impossible to scale. If anyone tried, they'd get arrows and hot oil and boulders chucked on them. And there was one way in, this bridge. It used to be a drawbridge. Can you imagine trying to storm these gates? Nobody ever did it successfully. Built on a natural bluff overlooking the city, the citadel encircles the remains of some of the oldest settlements in the region, stretching back over 4,000 years. Crac de Chevalier was state-of-the-art in castle building for its day. Its design is based on a double-layered defense system featuring a ring-like outer fortress containing numerous watchtowers, walls over 3 meters thick, and a moat surrounding an even more imposing inner fortress. Could be straight out of the storybook, couldn't it? It's pretty much exactly as it was 800 years ago. The architecture is fantastic, but what's interesting is that the Crusaders learned their castle building from the Islamic military architects that were here. There was nothing like it in Europe at the time. So they took those skills back to Europe and started a whole new thing. Crac de Chevalier was never taken by force, but it was ultimately captured in the 13th century when the Crusader armies across the region were suffering heavy losses. Surrounded by Muslim armies, the mere 200 knights left inside the castle surrendered, marking a turning point in the history of the Crusades.
During the era of the Crusades, two of the greatest powers in Christian Europe were the city-states of Venice and Pisa, who competed with each other for mastery of the hugely profitable Mediterranean trade routes. Funded by the city's wealth, the greatest historic site in Pisa is the world-famous Leaning Tower. It was built between the 12th and 14th centuries as the freestanding bell tower of the city's cathedral. Ian Wright takes a closer look.
I've got to be honest with you, when the tower was first built, it had a little bit of a lean to it, and the reason for that is foolishly they built it on sandstone that is soft. But if you think about it, look at that. It's a nice 12-bedroom, it's got a studio flat at the top. Yeah, there is a little bit of subsidence on this side. I'll tell you what, I'll knock a bit of the price off for you, yeah? As I know you, yeah? Think about it.
In the 12th century, Pisa was a maritime superpower, and their conquest extended to North Africa. Bernardo Pisano started work on the Tower of Pisa in 1173, and it took over 100 years to build. His designs were heavily influenced by Arab architecture.
By the 1990s, the famous Tower of Pisa was falling at a rate of 1 millimetre per year. So they closed it down for 10 years to work out a way of rescuing it, because let's face it, it'd be a real shame to lose one of the most impressive medieval buildings in the whole of Italy. Yeah. The top of the tower still leans out 4 metres from its southern base, but since the restoration, the experts now reckon it's going to be safe for another 200 years.
Both Pisa and Venice were maritime powers. They sent substantial fleets to fight in the Crusades, for example, and throughout the Middle Ages, much of their huge wealth came from maritime trade. For hundreds of years along Venice's magnificent Grand Canal, the city's richest merchant families vied with each other to build the most palatial residences, showing off their wealth to the world. No merchant's palace, however, could compete with the splendor of the Palazzo Ducale. Built in the early 14th century on the edge of St. Mark's Square, right next to the famous Basilica San Marco, it was both the seat of the city's government and home of the Venetian Republic's leader, the Doge. Justine Shapiro takes a look around.
The Doge's palace was built during the golden age of the Venetian Republic, and everything about it is meant to impress. The government rooms boast some of the most important works of art of the time, depicting scenes of Venetian glory and conquest. Francesco da Mosto comes from a long line of Venetian aristocracy and has an insider's knowledge of the Doges.
So what is a Doge?
The Doge was not a king.
No.
Here, Venice was not a monarchy, but a republic, an aristocratic republic. And he was elected by the Great Council.
And for how long did he serve his
term?
term?
For all his life.
Life term.
And just in here, on the top of the walls, there are all the Doges that ruled Venice in the long history of the republic, one after the other one.
The huge wealth that flowed into Venice from maritime trade encouraged the city's merchants to look ever further afield for profitable new markets. And so it was that in the late 13th century, a young Venetian merchant set out on a 24-year journey of discovery that would help to open up the world. His name, of course, was Marco Polo. At the time of Marco Polo's remarkable journey all the way from Venice to China, a huge swathe of Asia, including China, was ruled by the fearsome Mongol Empire. Its capital was Karakorum in modern-day Mongolia.
This is where Genghis Khan used to rule his entire empire. On the plains here would be hundreds and thousands of his nomadic warriors, and he'd set them out from this point to conquer the rest of the world. Although Westerners think of Genghis Khan as a barbaric warlord, Mongolians revere him as a hero. He united the nomadic tribes and built the largest empire the world has ever known. When Marco Polo came to Karakorum, he said it was one of the most amazing cities that he'd ever seen. It was full of temples, fountains, and grand palaces. Then the Manchurians came and razed the whole place to the ground. And these stones, the only thing left of the Genghis Khan era.
The Mongol Empire's greatest conquest was hugely civilized China. And in 1264, Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, moved the Mongol capital from remote Karakorum to what is modern-day Beijing. But in 1368, Beijing was recaptured by the Chinese Ming dynasty, and the Mongols were chased back into Mongolia. To try to prevent them invading again, the Ming rebuilt the Great Wall of China. Stretching 4,500 miles through northern China, the Great Wall is one of the wonders of the world. Megan McCormick takes a look around.
The Great Wall was started over 2,000 years ago by China's first emperor, Emperor Qin. The original Qin Wall, built mostly of compressed dirt and sticky rice, fell into disrepair after his defeat in 207 BC. It wasn't until the 14th century that the Ming dynasty started to build this brick Great Wall, taking 200 years to reach its full length. It is said they used enough bricks to encircle the Earth 5 times around the equator. With 10,000 towers on the wall and a minimum of 10 soldiers per tower, they needed a standing army of at least 100,000 just to defend all of it. And this, the Forbidden City, was the heart of the ancient capital. Completed in 1420, the Forbidden City was the fabled home to 24 of China's emperors. Covering an area of 2 square miles, it has over 9,000 rooms. The center of the empire, the Forbidden City is the architecture of power and intimidation, designed to inspire awe. Approaching the huge main Meridian Gate, you pass through an area once filled with imperial and military offices, still used by the military today. This gate reveals the impressive beginning to the inner city. Everything here has meaning, and that meaning is meant to reinforce the idea that the emperor is the son of God and that the dynasty will rule forever. That is where the dragon throne is and where the emperor sat in all his splendor. 100,000 members of the imperial palace would be assembled here, and upon his arrival, an official would call out and they would drop to their knees, kowtowing 9 times to him.
When Marco Polo had returned to Europe, his astonishing account of what he'd seen in China helped to encourage subsequent European explorers to seek faster ways of reaching the vast riches of the East. One avid reader of Marco Polo's book, Christopher Columbus, had the novel idea of sailing west to get to the East, and in 1485, he approached the Portuguese king for funding. The Americas were as yet undiscovered, though Portugal had begun exploring the Atlantic and the west coast of Africa. And when a Portuguese expedition first rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, Columbus's plan was turned down by the Portuguese king. Portugal would sail east to reach the riches of the Indies, not west.
It's from this port that the Portuguese charted unsailed waters, discovering new lands and bringing back a great deal of wealth in gold and spices. They created an incredible capital that is still thriving centuries later. This is beautiful Lisbon. Along the dockside in Lisbon, there are castles and monuments dating from the 15th and 16th centuries, known as the Age of Discovery. These intrepid explorers included Vasco da Gama, who discovered new routes to India, and others who discovered Brazil, West Africa, and the Azores. The spices, silks, and gold from all this exploration and colonization made Portugal very wealthy, and for 200 years, one of the dominant empires in the world.
Spurned by Portugal, Columbus approached Spain's Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand to fund his voyage west. But Spain's priority was liberating Andalusia from hundreds of years of Muslim rule. And Columbus was told to ask again once the Moors' capital of Granada had been captured. In 1491, it was, as Christina Chang finds out.
Some people say if you haven't seen Granada, you haven't seen anything at all. When the Moors came up from Africa in the 8th century, they successfully occupied southern Spain for over 700 years and developed the most cultured society of medieval Europe. Granada became their seat of power. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella liberated it in 1491 from the unfortunate Moorish ruler Boabdil, also known as Boabdil el Chico. After a heavy siege, Boabdil decided to surrender the town and thus Moorish rule. But one of the reasons he gave Granada up without a fight was to avoid the destruction of this. This is the famous Alhambra. Originally built as a fortress in the 11th century, it is the most visited monument in Europe and one of the best examples of Moorish architecture in the world. This is the Salón de Embajadores, where the Sultan would have political discussions. It is here that Boabdil signed his surrender in 1492, which, by the way, was the same year that King Ferdinand met here with Columbus to discuss new trading plans for the Far East.
With the Moors now defeated, Spain could afford to turn its attentions overseas. Columbus finally got the funding he needed and set sail west into the unknown. On the 12th October 1492, Columbus made landfall in what is today the Bahamas. Within a few weeks, he'd also discovered what we now know as Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Unknowingly, Columbus had discovered the Americas. He thought he'd reached the East Indies, near to China, and so named the natives Indians. For the American natives, the arrival of the Spaniards was a catastrophe. In the Dominican Republic's capital, Santo Domingo, Megan McCormick explores the grim history beneath the ruins of the historic San Francisco Monastery, the oldest in the New World.
The original inhabitants of this island were a race of friendly Taino Indians, but today, no trace of their existence remains. Now, when Christopher Columbus arrived here in 1492, he put the 3 million native Indians to work building him this city. However, within 50 years, they were virtually wiped out. They died from exhaustion, starvation, and disease brought by the Spanish. To complete the city and these secret underground tunnels, the Taino were replaced by new slaves brought in from Africa. They were chained up and worked 16 hours a day in the sugar mills. Their average life expectancy as slaves was a mere 6 years. 500 years later, the hidden secret of this sacred ground has come back to haunt them. On the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, thousands of bodies of slaves, still in their iron shackles, were found in the grounds of this monastery looming over the city.
From Santo Domingo, their first foothold in the New World, Spain conquered a massive American empire within 50 years. Closer to home, the mighty size of the Spanish Empire, despite the defeat of the Moors, was now beginning to be matched by another rising Muslim empire. Its capital was Istanbul, in modern Turkey. Until 1453, Istanbul, then Constantinople, was the capital of Byzantium. Its cathedral, the Hagia Sophia, was Christianity's greatest church. Estelle Bingham checks it out.
When the Ottomans came and conquered in 1453, Mehmet II came straight to Hagia Sophia, but fell in love with it and told his soldiers not to sack the place. He turned it into a mosque instead, and a week later attended the first Muslim service here.
According to Islam, images of anything with an immortal soul are not allowed, so the Christian mosaics were plastered over for almost 500 years. Today the mosque is a museum, and the 1,500-year-old beautiful mosaics are being restored.
Look at that, mosaics uncovered.
As the former centre of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul has more spectacular mosques in one city than anywhere else in the world.
Everyone knows this is the Blue Mosque, and when you get inside, you'll know why.
The blue hue from over 20,000 Iznik tiles gave rise to its nickname.
When you look in this mosque, you can see just how far the Sultan went into making this place look better than the place next door. There are 50 different types of Iznik tile here.
Iznik tiles originated 2,400 years ago in the village of Iznik in northwest Turkey. These tiles, favoured by the sultans, reached their peak in the 16th century, but within 100 years, the craft was mysteriously lost. The Blue Mosque is still the most popular place for services, and guests are welcome. Topkapi, home to the great Ottoman sultans and their concubines for over 4 centuries, is more than just a palace. It's a huge complex of gardens, houses, and a 400-room harem.
Well, this is it, the doorway to the harem of 1,000 concubines. Once you got through here, no one would ever see you but the Sultan, his personal family, and some very special guards. They're called the eunuchs. This is the Imperial Hall, the largest room in the harem. The concubines would sit here, and the Sultan would be lounging here. Now, the goal of a slave girl was to catch his eye, and she could do that by singing or dancing on this carpet. If you made it as far as the bedchamber, your luck's in. Give him a son, and you could become the most powerful woman in the realm.
Beyond the gilded precincts of the royal palace, the Ottoman sultans presided over a highly cultured empire. But during the same era, probably the most magnificent golden age of culture in the entire history of the world was taking place elsewhere, in Italy, and in particular, Florence. In contrast to the absolutist monarchies of the Ottoman Empire and other European nations, the more egalitarian and democratic nature of the Italian city-states encouraged the humanistic Renaissance to blossom. But there was only relative equality, of course, and it was the money of the rich that financed the Renaissance and the great buildings it left behind.
Okay, follow me. Come on, everyone round, listen up. Because this is where the art tour begins. With this guy on the horse, it's Cosimo I, and he is from the famous Medici family, which were the richest in Florence. In fact, it was their money that practically built the whole city into the Renaissance town we know today.
And under the Medici rule, Florence became the cultural and intellectual capital of Europe. They had cash to burn and they wanted the world to know it. Artists flocked in for the money and built all these amazing cathedrals, palaces and sculptures. The city of Florence commissioned Michelangelo to make a statue that would represent Florence. He thought of David, a small boy defeating a giant, in the same way symbolising Florence as a small republic able to defeat larger kingdoms.
This colossal 17-foot Goliath-slaying statue of David confirmed Michelangelo is the best artist in the whole of Italy. And amazingly, he'd done this at the age of 29. Oh, I have wasted my life. This is the historical centre of Florence, and smack bang in the middle is the Piazza del Duomo, which is that cathedral. And it's so immense that there's nowhere in the city where you can see it all at once.
The real attraction of Brunelleschi's Duomo is its dominating red-tiled dome.
If you really want to appreciate the dome and the cathedral, you have to walk up the 463 steps to the top. Oh, it better be worth it, I tell you. Oh, look at that. Look at that fresco. It was painted by Vasari, and it's the Judgment Day. You can see Jesus up there, and he's actually stopped the world, and now he's judging everyone down below. So the top, you've got the angels, and you've got heaven, and as we filter down, oh dear, it's all gone a bit wrong for them. Look at them, there's some really nasty things happening there. No, 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 no. Oh, that's too much, son. Ooh. Oh, yeah, wow, look at that. Oh.
From Florence, the great cultural flowering of the Renaissance gradually spread its influence across the rest of Europe. In England, now a fast rising power, the first major building to use Renaissance-style architecture was Hampton Court Palace in London, as Megan McCormick discovers.
Hampton Court Palace was the royal residence of possibly the most famous king of England, Henry VIII. Off with his head!
This is the staircase leading to the King's apartments, and it was designed to impress visitors, and as you can see, it still does. This is the guard chamber, and originally you would have had about 40 or 50 guards in here, making sure that only the most important people got any further or any closer to the king. And it all depended on how well dressed you were.
You think I would have made it?
No.
Oh, that's too bad.
And then finally we come into perhaps one of the most important rooms, which is the King's State Bedchamber. And this was as far as you could come, really, before you got into the King's private apartments, where only the King and his very closest servants could go.
Henry VIII is famous, of course, for having had 6 wives, 2 of which he had beheaded. When his first wife failed to bear him a son to inherit the throne, Henry wanted a divorce, but the Pope refused to allow such a thing. Furious, Henry declared an independent Church of England, headquartered here at Canterbury Cathedral, not in Rome. When the Archbishop of Canterbury granted the divorce in defiance of the Pope, the seeds of conflict were sown between Protestant England and Catholicism. By the late 16th century, Europe's greatest power was Catholic Spain, with its huge overseas empire. When the inevitable war with England broke out in 1585, Sir Francis Drake was sent to attack Santo Domingo, then Cartagena in modern-day Colombia, protected by the San Felipe fortress. The amazingly well-preserved fortress in Cartagena, founded in 1533, is one of South America's greatest historic sites of the period.
This fort here at San Felipe the Fortress, the biggest fort ever built by the Spanish here in Americas.
Both north and south, this is the biggest.
Yeah, this is the biggest one.
Yeah, this is a very serious fort then.
Yeah.
And it looks to be pretty intact.
We could say that the 90% of what we see here, it's original. Yeah.
During his single raid on Cartagena in 1586, Drake set fire to the cathedral, held the city hostage for more than 100 days, before agreeing not to level it in return for a huge ransom of 10 million pesos.
Drake's military exploits are legendary, but less well known is that he was also a slave trader who was amongst the first to capture slaves in West Africa before selling them to Caribbean plantation owners. Starting on a small scale in the 16th century, the brutally profitable Atlantic slave trade grew hugely over the following centuries. All of Europe was involved, and by the time the trade was abolished, over 10 million slaves had been transported from Africa to the Americas. European forts were built all along the African coast to house captured slaves, mostly in West Africa. In modern-day Ghana, Megan McCormick visits the Fort of Elmina. But first, Ian Wright checks out Mozambique Island, home to the oldest fort in East Africa.
This is the fort of São Sebastião. It is the oldest complete fort still standing in sub-Saharan Africa. Its 400 cannon protected Portuguese interest in gold, ivory, and slavery.
This is Elmina Castle. It was first built by the Portuguese and then later taken over by the Dutch in the 16th century when the slave trade began. And this is the dungeon where the female slaves were kept, packed in, sometimes 100, 150 at a time, sometimes for as long as 3 months before they were shipped out. From that balcony, the governor would look down and choose which woman he wanted to have sex with. She'd then be washed down and hauled up these stairs and raped. And just over there is Cape Coast, where the British were up to the same thing. Here, the men's dungeons were even worse. They crammed hundreds of men in here, separated them from their families. In fact, that's the only daylight that they had. The guards used to chuck food from up there. They were afraid to come down because, among other things, they might catch a disease. There were 76 forts like this along the Gold Coast, and until the slave trade was abolished in 1865, millions of slaves were herded to waiting ships which took them to the New World. The conditions were far worse than anything they'd already endured, and they died in droves.
long in the field, have handled a plenty.
The average life expectancy for enslaved Africans on plantations was a mere 7 years. Plantation owners did their sums and calculated that rather than looking after the slaves they owned, it was cheaper to work them to death and then ship across fresh slaves from Africa. The major European slave trading powers such as Spain, Britain, and France soon carved up the highly profitable Caribbean islands between them. On St. Lucia, Rodney's Fort was built to protect the sugarcane plantations worked so profitably by African slaves. Zoe Palmer is shown around this historic site.
We're in the middle of Rodney's Fort. French and British were always fighting. The British needed this island to protect its sugar interests and its slave interests and so.
So it was a really good location for anyone with sugar interests in this region.
Sugar, yeah. At the time.
Yeah.
Because they were all threatened. Each one was threatening the other.
Wow!
Yeah.
Look at this.
Isn't that something? The whole idea is that with the height, you had the advantage of your firepower. Because from here you can see the movement of the French fleet, whether they came from the north or from the south.
It's kind of hard to imagine just looking over it now and thinking that so many people died fighting over sugarcane.
To protect the territories they'd captured, Europe's great powers built many other similarly imposing historic forts all across the Caribbean, such as Fort Zeelandia in Guyana and Brimstone Hill in St. Kitts. Beyond the Caribbean, Britain, France, and Spain settled the North American mainland too. In 1620, British settlers aboard the Mayflower founded Plymouth, and over the next 150 years, colonial America expanded rapidly, with Virginia the center of British rule. By the 1770s, colonial Americans in town after town would be agitating for independence from Britain. But in the beginning, the first colonists brought their British values with them.
It was 1620 when the first settlers on American soil arrived from England. Pretty safe to assume that when they arrived, they had no idea that their... Hello? How are you? It's pretty safe to assume that they had no idea that their values and their ethics would shape the foundations of the United States. There were 102 people who made the trip. They set up camp here just a few miles from where they actually landed. This village is called Plymouth Plantation, and it is a working representation of how life was back then. Hello. Hey, what's up? It's kind of hard to believe that out of this small settlement spring the beginnings of the America we know today.
Time stands still for no man, and the settlements quickly developed, and within 200 years, Virginia had become the largest British colony in the Americas. This is Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia, and under British rule.
It's 1774, and there's a bit of unease in the town. People are talking about trying to shake England off their back. The voices of dissent. And I've heard about this guy in town who's really stirring it up. His name is Thomas Jefferson. Right, that's it, Thomas Jefferson. I'll see if I can track him down.
Colonial Williamsburg, the experience, receives over 4 million visitors per year. It is an incredible exhibit, at least for its sheer size. It recreates the whole town just as it was in 1774, and no stone was left unturned in restoring it to its former glory. The town is 1 mile long by a half a mile wide and has taverns, courthouses, shops, and even a population, some of whom are apparently destined for great things.
Mr. Jefferson, what would you like? Do you want independence from England?
Well, I should like to remain loyal so long as His Majesty will remain loyal to us. But if he is to break the covenant, his side of the compact, well then how well we know that nature does give us the right to take up arms and defend our natural rights.
Well, I have an idea. I mean, why not start a revolution? You know, you guys have a good chance of winning.
Within a decade, life had become pretty bleak in these parts. Virginia was in the throes of the Revolutionary War, and bloodshed and loss of life were high. However, victory was in sight, and life in the Americas was going to change forever.
This is Yorktown. This is where the final battle of the Revolutionary War was fought and won in 1781.
The Battle of Yorktown was a defining moment in U.S. history. The victorious Americans claimed independence from England and ensured immortality for their heroic general, George Washington.
This is George Washington's house. He was the first president of the United States. The house is called Mount Vernon, even though there ain't no mountain anywhere around here. It's one of those fancy names. This was George Washington's private study, his personal space. And this room kind of gives you a sense of why it was George Washington who was elected to be the first president of the United States. And he wasn't just a man of action, you know, he fought wars, he explored the wilderness, he farmed his land, but really he was a man of ideas. You know, he took from what he read and applied what he thought best to creating a new country.
Within a few years, the resounding words from the USA's Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," helped to inspire Republican revolution in Europe too. In France at this time, the Palace of Versailles near Paris was home to Marie Antoinette. Wife of King Louis XVI, she'd been born in Vienna as an Austrian Habsburg princess at the Schönbrunn Palace. In the 18th century, Europe's monarchies intermarried frequently to try to hold on to power. Wealthier than ever, their profligate extravagance caused growing resentment.
Check this out, right? The Habsburg family, they've got this beautiful winter palace, the Hofburg, but oh no, they're not satisfied with that. They're like, where are we going to go in summer? So they build this huge palace for themselves.
Schönbrunn Palace is Vienna's answer to Versailles. It's nearly 1,500 rooms, and in its day was manned by over 1,000 servants.
The Palace of Versailles was originally just a small hunting lodge, but in 1682, the extravagant King Louis XIV hugely extended it to be his principal home, housing thousands of courtiers. A century later, Marie Antoinette and the rest of the French royal family, equally extravagant and extremely unpopular, paid the price. Attempts to introduce new taxes sparked an uprising, and in 1789, the revolution began. Starting at the Place de la Bastille in nearby Paris, Adela Ukar is being taken on a tour of the great historic sites of the revolution.
The Bastille was actually torn down just after the revolution began. However, there is a little reminder. If you look, there's one of the round tower outlines. I can see. Behind me is another one, and then a third one off in that direction. And that plus the plaque is the only reminder of this great ancient fortress.
From Bastille, we make our way 2.5 kilometers west to the Conciergerie. Once a grand palace, it became a jail and housed prisoners of the revolution. And one of those was Queen Marie Antoinette, who was condemned to die at the guillotine.
This was called the preparation room. And is that a basket full of hair? Yes, it's a rather eerie reminder of what they did. They actually cut their hair.
Really? Why?
Well, a guillotine, like any single blade, actually doesn't cut hair very well. You need the kind of scissoring action to cut hair. So it would get in the way of the guillotine blade, and that's why it was cut free. This is the route that the prisoners took and were taken towards the Place de la Concorde, which at the Revolution was called Place de la Révolution.
And how did the crowd react to her execution?
The crowd was very hostile, partly because they were already angry at the Queen, for who she was, but partly because her tumbril, her cart, was preceded by a man who was on a horse and who was told to rile them up. And when she finally reached the square, she was very stoic. She probably resigned herself to her fate. She climbed very steep steps to get to the platform where the guillotine was, and she accidentally stepped on the toe of the man who was going to execute her and said to him, "I'm sorry, monsieur, I did not do it on purpose." And that is said to be the last words of Marie Antoinette.
Following the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte became leader of France in 1799 and set about building a powerful European empire as well as grandly remodeling Paris so its splendor befitted an imperial capital. But Britain stood in Napoleon's way, and French defeats at the naval battle of Trafalgar in 1805 and at Waterloo in 1815 sealed his downfall. Katie Haswell and Ian Wright explore the Napoleonic War's great historic sites.
Britain is a maritime nation. The great naval town of Portsmouth is where the modern Navy was born. 200 years ago, during the war with France, Britain's ultimate hero was Admiral Nelson. He revolutionised the British Navy and completely demolished the enemy's fleet at the Battle of Trafalgar. And this is his 104-gun flagship, HMS Victory. HMS Victory cost the equivalent of $100 million to build, and 6,000 oak trees were used in its construction. But life on board Nelson's ship was tough. You got 6 lashes for falling asleep on duty and 18 for filthiness.
Yes, it was a hard life, but life was equally harsh on the land.
Yeah.
So these people were used to these kind of conditions, and this was an organised, regimented system they were working in, no different from the modern services.
How many in the whole ship?
Well, the whole ship's crew was 820.
And this is the actual spot where Nelson fell?
Yeah, this is the actual spot where Nelson fell at around about 1:25 on the afternoon of Trafalgar.
Lord Nelson died 3 hours later, having been told that the enemy fleet had been defeated. His last words were, "I have done my duty, I praise God for it."
The date is June 15th, the year 1815. The location, Waterloo, about 10 miles south of Brussels. Two mighty armies meet head-to-head. France's Napoleon Bonaparte and Britain's Duke of Wellington face each other across a shallow valley.
These are the fields where the Battle of Waterloo was fought, and a preservation order's been put on them, so they're exactly as they were in 1815. You can see the kind of the ridges in the land, and even the farmhouses are exactly as they were. Nothing can be built on this. Wellington and his troops were on this ridge over here, and Napoleon was on that ridge over there, facing them 1 kilometre apart, and it was carnage. Apparently 15,000 men were killed between the hours of 11 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock in the evening, and another 20,000 in the following days of their injuries.
Britain was now unchallenged as the world's greatest power and set about building a huge global empire. At home, Britain used its vast wealth to build a network of canals and railways across the country. The industrialization of the world had begun. The network of canals built by Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century made transporting goods much easier. A horse could pull a load on a canal boat dozens of times heavier than on a cart on the roads. During its heyday, Britain's canal network benefited from some of the greatest industrial architecture of the age. On the Grand Union Canal, Justine Shapiro travels through Braunston Tunnel, completed in 1796.
How long is this tunnel?
about 3/4 of a mile. When you came to a tunnel, the horse went over the top, and then men were employed to what they call leg the boats through the tunnel. You would have 2 men, possibly even 4, who would lay on the roof of the boat with their legs in the air and push their feet against the roof of the tunnel and leg the thing through. They'd part their legs.
They would literally move the boat along with their feet.
Yeah, leg power. That's where the term leg it comes from.
Leg it.
Leg it.
Like move it.
Move
leg
it. Hop it. Go away. Leg it. We're going through a tunnel. Push, boys, push. If I only knew the words.
The pace of change in the world was now speeding up. Within less than 50 years, the canals became outmoded ancient history, as from the 1830s, the invention of the steam train revolutionized transport. During the reign of Queen Victoria, from 1837 onwards, Britain extended its power across the world, and the steam train was a potent symbol of the speed with which industrial might would soon transform the world on a global scale. The Industrial Revolution has left a legacy of historic sites, like this extraordinary viaduct built on the Settle to Carlisle line in the 1870s. Such feats of engineering ushered in the modern age, and as the world steamed ahead into the 20th century, the future we know today was already in sight.